Welcome to the Life Coaching with Ryan podcast, episode 11. Today, I wrap up my conversation with Chris and discussing the passing of his father and the different choices he made while processing his father's death and the things that his father left behind. And next week is going to be a little bit different, as I'm going to talk to my friend Jenny about the same topic, but her very different experiences with her own parents passing. So, enjoy.
And it was paid for. So it was a really nice process.
Margareta, the author of the the Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning, I'm going to probably butcher her name too, Margareta Magnusson.
Yeah.
It sounds like you did almost exactly what she would recommend, which is fascinating that you came to that independently, because she was talking about having an auctioneer come and help her mother when her mother was at the end of her life choose what to take, what not to take, and they helped move things, because they were making their money on the sale of the items. They charged $0 up front.
Right.
And so it's interesting that you had a very similar experience with that. Go ahead.
Oh, so what I was going to say is the company, by the way, my father railed, this is gone, or this is, that was his dementia talking. The company was fantastic. And I don't want to imply that the company was, they did everything they wanted to do and that you're dealing with irrational people. And they were great, and I would highly recommend you check them out.
It's so funny because when you were talking about it, I'm like, okay, my life coach brain kicks on immediately, yeah? And here's the emotion behind what you're saying and the self-judgment and what you're saying, and goes, okay, real talk, even if he was mad at you and not the company, I mean, it's wonderful for your wife to be able to use that kind of dissemblage in that moment. But the truth of the matter is, coming to the conclusion and the understanding that, no, you did make the right steps. And even if he was angry at you, exactly as you just said, it's the dementia, it's these other things that are happening, it's things that you can't possibly control or take responsibility for. It doesn't mean we don't. We're human. We care. You care about your dad. You want to do the right thing. Something Jenny and I were talking about. Jenny, so you know, is the person I did the first podcast with.
Right.
She was saying how she has this good girl identity that she's grown up with, and good girl translates to good mom or good this or good that, and so you had the same. I want to be a good boy, I want to be a good son, I want to be a good family member, I want to do the right thing by my family. So this is again part of that emotional experience as you're trying to go about doing the quote right thing unquote, for your family. So You're sorry. Did you say?
Oh no, I think one of the things that you really liked was probably one of the things, if I could project, that you found most touching was the actual few moments of death and how we approached that too.
Yes,
and that's something that
was
I
actually
think
just
really,
what I was going to ask about.
You wanted to do, and so I'm slowly sort of tripping through the process, getting So my dad had clearly, I think, in retrospect, it was pretty clear, because I called his doctors and talked with him. He had at the end. He was really good until, and the drugs were continuing apparently to work for his primary tumor, but he had growth in his secondary tumors, and it had slowed the secondary tumor growth to the point where he had a lot of quality life. It was uncomfortable and painful, and the drugs they weren't miracle drugs, they had a lot of side effects, but eventually the slow growth, it was metastatic, and I'm pretty sure he had a brain tumor that eventually resulted in a stroke, and that's what actually hypoxia of his brain and killed him and slowed him down. But what was really another hard conversation was that I called up his doctor, and his doctor didn't actually necessarily have the direct answer for me, kind of alluded to it, but put me down a path with other people, other physicians that he knew that could help me. And I was like, well, what should I look for physiologically to know that he's coming, And my mom had been saying he's slowing down, and we could tell he was taking more naps, and we got a hospital bed for him. And then he passed. Well, he was... The physiological signs for his passing would probably be different than somebody else's, but what you'll see is a a progressive loss of consciousness, and then that kind of gives you an idea. If you got a couple days, and then you can start to see changes in respiration, and then you can see a spike in blood pressure, and then after that you've got like a couple hours.
Yeah.
So for me, having the conversation about like what physiologically to look for helped me time, because a friend of mine who is, for lack of a better word, an adopted brother, grew up with me, considers my dad a second dad. I called him up and asked him to join me, and so my wife and my kids and for this conversation I'll call my brother, he joined us and it was really, really great. So one of the other things that I think shocked a lot of people was that near the end, I was like, you know what? My father was a massive extrovert. We're not going to put him away in the closet. So we actually put the hospital bed in the middle of the living room. And there were kids doing puzzles in the corner, and there were, and there were people coming in and out, and, the end process, because he had chosen, as part of Advanced Directive, he didn't want supportive life care. He was happy to have palliative medicine, and I administered morphine to him at the end. But I eventually got to the point where, after watching the hospice people for enough time, was like, I can do this. Go away. This is family. This is family. I don't need you here. And so I ministered to him at the end, and I'm so glad that I did. I took the. And I'm not saying that I was, again, everybody could do this, but I'm a former EMT. I also have plenty of clinical experience, so I feel very comfortable with administering the medications and, managing.
You're able to maintain, manage. That's what I was
And
looking
there are
for.
biological things that happen at the end, like, the person might need suction and, changes in respiratory and checking for moment of death and those sort of things that I felt very comfortable with, that I don't think a lot of other people would.
Yeah,
and
that's
again,
pretty
that
unique.
could be
That's pretty unique.
that you could easily put out to. That's another place where you could possibly outsource, like have somebody who you trust and interview to be there with you and like, okay, this is passing, to sort of guide you through those things. But so what happened was, we had realized that he was getting sicker and sicker, and his dementia was getting worse, to the point where he was complaining about his tooth. He was complaining, and he was like, my tooth hurts, and he was in his bathrobe, no underwear on, kind of flapping there in the breeze, and I was in the back garden, and he goes, Chris, my tooth is hurting. I'm going to take it out. And I was like, wait, the fuck? And my wife's like, whatever you're doing, go take care of your dad. And he was like, I need a pair of pliers. I'm going to take it. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, my teeth are going to fall out. They're going to, it's going to fall out while I'm sleeping and choke. I'm going to choke. And I was like, okay, that's a thing. Like, okay, that I could see that happening. But I was like, so, okay, old man, can I reach into your mouth and checking your teeth? And he was like, yeah. He's like, see, it's coming out. I'm like, I'm not sure I'm buying that, but okay. And I was there at a minute where I was like, I'm pretty sure he's only got 4 or 5 weeks left. Let's say he tears this tooth out of his head, or I help him tear this tooth out of his head.
All right.
Is it going to reduce the time he has left? Is it going to give him more joy, a sense of completion? And I was like, okay. So I went and got fucking pliers, and we took it out of his head.
You didn't tell me that story.
And I was like, and what was so weird is I gave it to him, and I was like, okay, Dad, and I was like, do you want me? And he's like, I'll do it, and he came back, and he came back out with this like tooth in the pliers, and he's so proud of himself. He's like, is he? And my wife's just like, oh my God, is this foreshadowing of what you're gonna be like at all? Because I've done like minor surgery and stuff on myself. She's like, oh my God, I can't, and he was just so proud, and I just wanted to be like, okay,
he had that experience.
He had that experience, and I was there for him, and I helped him with it. Like, it was, I don't want to read too much into it emotionally, but I felt like he was like, at the end, am in control of this dying body, this, rattle trap thing that's barely making it across the finish line, but God damn it, I'll be fucked if I don't take care of myself, And I kept going like, Dad, we'll make an appointment for tomorrow.
Right, yeah.
We'll make an emergency. And he was like, no, I'm going to do this. And I was like,
yeah.
And there were a number of other situations where he uncatheterized himself, like, with a Foley catheter. And I was like, Dad, you got to, like, because with these catheters, they usually fill a balloon with water to keep it in. And he just reached right out without, and I was just like, holy
people
shit,
can't see
Dad.
my face right now.
and I got to the point where I was like, hey, are you bleeding? Let's check. Is there blood? Let's check this out. And I did. I went and I examined his genitalia and like, hey, I want to make sure you're not going to hemorrhage. Here, and it appeared the blood had stopped. And we got to get him recatheterized, and but there's that, being present for that, like, really helped me, like, where is he? Like, he's not making logical decisions anymore, and I know a lot of people are going to be like, I can't believe you let your dad do that. I'm like, yeah, but I got to empower, like, it's going to happen. By this point, it was very clear that it was going to happen within a couple weeks, and like, I don't know, give him joy, don't try and control the situation,
right.
Like,
I get it.
So then finally what did happen was I noticed that he had sort of met the physiological criterion for death being within the next 12 to 24 hours. And by that time, he was not very lucid. And what was really nice is that one of my children had a medical condition. And the last conversation I had with him that was lucid, right? Because I had had other would have had other conversations with him after this point, but the last conversation, he really just sort of kind of opened his eyes, and I was sitting next to him, and I'd called into work, by the way, and told them I'm going to be out, and went on family medical leave. And I called, and I was there with him, and he kind of opened his eyes, and he put his hand on me. He said, "How's my granddaughter?" And I said, "She's doing well." He's like, "We figured out what the problem was, right?" "Yeah." And then he kind of like laid back, and that was, for me, like, there were no deathbed words like, "I regret being such a dick," which is what everybody kind of hoped for. But it was like this, like, I acknowledge that you are a good dad, and we're trying to feel like, it felt good to me to have that opportunity. And again, that's not something you're like, well, we're on the clock, old man, say your thing, and let's, I had to give him the space to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And what was particularly nice about that was, after that, we did have conversation, but I don't know that he knew who I was. Like, I told him of my early childhood memories, and then he was talking like, oh, that was a good time. And then he would tell me something, and I think he was thinking like that was his memory. Like, it wasn't clear, like, but the process for me, once I got over, like, I'm trying to communicate with him as like him, I'm giving up, like, he has already changed. Then for me, the process of sharing was giving him comfort. It didn't matter whether they were my memories or his memories, and we did have this one collective memory of a boat that we had, growing up, and how I had stolen the boat. And he laughed, and he told me stuff that I was like, that didn't happen in my memory. And I realized he had projected, like, things that had happened onto his memory. And he had ended up stealing the same boat when he was my age. I mean, it was a very old, nice boat, or it was a different boat that he had taken. But it was nice to have those conversations, but they weren't what I would say, like, Chris was talking to his dad, right?
Again, that's that identity thing. You were present. It was so crystal in my head as you were talking, and of course now that I open my mouth, it's gone. But essentially, you were able to be present with him without the baggage of it needing to be something.
Right.
I need to be his son right now. Why doesn't he recognize me? Or it needs to be factual, or whatever the perceived need and expectation was.
Right.
You were able to be present with what it was.
Right.
And I know that came of over 5 years of time. It's not like, and from the very moment you knew he was passing, you were like, I have just given all this up and now I'm perfectly zen. Because you're talking about the anger and frustration and everything else.
Exactly.
But through this 5-year process, here you are at the end of his life, and you're able to, having done that self-work, be present with him and just let it be what it was.
And one of the things that I was prepared for, when somebody passes naturally without assisted, ventilation or anything, there's usually agonal breathing, and it can be very difficult.
Agonal is like the ragged...
Yeah, sort of. And that can go on for some time, right? And so it was very difficult because I had my kids there, and my kids, though, I was like, Pop-Pop's passing, and this is part of his passing, and they were totally, like, surprisingly cool. They weren't there the whole time, like, we didn't keep a...
Right, it wasn't death porn.
But they were, right, exactly, but they walked in and out, they walked in and out, and they were like, okay, and they would, like, Mom says dinner's ready, and I would come in, so it was very much, and
I remember you telling me that when we were at the bar, and I was like, that is the most... Like, there are some people who are to hear that and go, you tortured your children.
Exactly. Exactly. And I had people who came to me and was like, that was not, you should have. And I was like, to what end? We've got chickens that are going to get eaten by coyotes someday. Like, how are we going to deal with?
My response was, what a gift. Mm-hmm. What a gift. Because that's right. Develops, when we talk about, when we wrap up, which we're not there yet, but I'm sure we're coming to time, is to talk about experiences of death and understanding of death and comfort with death. And I think it was a great gift because now your daughters have a completely different understanding and perspective on the presence of death in life.
Right.
And to have the conversation about transition, it's still grandma, but she's different. Mm-hmm. And she will be different, and she will continue to change in significant ways that you will notice. Like, holy crap, if someone had said that to me at 7, I don't know that I would have been as chill as your kids. I mean, let's be real.
You saw her, she's outside. She's just like, okay,
your kids are your own, right?
Yes, exactly.
So that's a thing. So they had whatever innate capacity to have that process, but you also offered them a way to be present, to process. I just said that word like 10 times, but to process that moment, to be present in that moment. And normalize it in a way that wasn't, like I said, it's not death porn.
And I'm hoping,
it's like,
right? It's just what's happening.
It's acceptance.
And this came back to actually my grandmother telling me about when her grandfather passed. Was her grandfather or her uncle? And just it seemed very much like he was in the salon with us, and we had his body there, and he passed, and everybody was like having dinner, and like it's just. And I want to prepare because both my children are going to encounter death again, whether it's in one of our chickens pass away, we have chickens, whether one of our chickens passes away, as I mentioned before, that we're going to have that conversation, or our neighbor's dog is going to pass, Mm-hmm. How do we deal with that? And so we have pictures, and then there were points at which my father sort of made these grasping motions with his hand, of course, and I was told that this would happen, and I'm assuming that he was there and present. He may not have been, it may have been just part of, as death happens, the brain doesn't all die at once.
Right.
Parts of it die separately, and so I held his hand, and he held my hand, and I tried to give him what I felt was the comfort he needed, and then there were points at which he was just completely, out of it, and then I basically took my kids out to dinner because I knew I saw some physiological signs and knew that, hey, we're within a couple hours here. Took them out for a quick bite, put them to bed, and then I sat with him with my mom and held his hand, and my mom stroked his hair as he took his last breaths, and we sort of counted, and once he passed, I got up, like within moments after I was pretty sure he had passed. I got my brother and my wife, who both were kind of like not. I think they wanted to give me the space, and then I got them, and then we all sat, and literally, his body was still warm and he was cooling, and then there was a moment, and it was this undefined moment when he became an it. Like the body, like it. We went from moving him to moving it,
processing,
right? And we all sort of, and everybody was like, it was this where we all sort of, between my mom and I and my brother and my wife, we all sort of kind of got up at a different point and went off to our own space to process for a few minutes or some time. But it was the scene like at the end. It felt to me like, this is weird, but it seemed like at the end of Ocean's 11, once they've done their thing and they're all sitting around watching the fountain and they're all kind of like nodding at each other, and like then they all kind of go off separately. And then I came back with my mom, and I washed the body, and then we sat vigil through the rest of the night for about 6 hours, and then the sun came up. And it was just this beautiful golden light that came through, and my mom and I sang a hymn that's very close to us, and we knew my father loved very much. And then we called the coroner, and we had a physician on call who came and legally pronounced death. And then we called the funeral home quietly, probably around 7 a.m. And that was. I just and then I just went, I made my kids breakfast, and then went to school and came back and took a nap, and it felt very like I wasn't empty, you know what I mean? I wasn't fulfilled, but it just felt like the right way to do things for us as a family, and I'm glad. And again, all the things and benefits and ways and conversations, and it was all a confluence of who the people were involved, the conversations we could have. I recognize not every family could have that conversation, and also the resources that were available. Not every family could have those resources, but it was really, it was good. It was a good passing, and to this day, I still think of how I would have done something different. And there are a few small things, but they're small details. Generally speaking, I felt like it was a good passing and it honored him. And then, of course, we had this funeral, but we didn't. Here's the other thing: we didn't rush into this funeral, right? Like, we weren't like, oh gosh, a week and a half later we have to have this funeral. We waited almost 5 weeks to have his funeral because we wanted to give people notice and process and tell everybody, so that we wouldn't have those awkward sort of, somebody's passed away, and we still did, have people that were out of contact and had to find out. But it was, I think it was just a really wonderful process. And so he was cremated per his wishes, and I had bought a columbarium, which is a box inside of the church that I go to regularly. So every other week that I end up going to church, I can go acknowledge his box and light a candle for him right there. And the kids are like, oh yeah, that's where Pop-Pop is. And there's so much more like they're like, okay, this is normal, right? As opposed to me stripping away years of, societal expectation. They're like, okay, this is what it is. And then we separated some of the ashes and into other little boxes, and we sent one to a place in Mexico that my dad had done a lot of missionary work. He and I went to Alaska and did a lot of time in Alaska together, so I'm going to take my mom on a cruise and we'll spread the ashes there. Nice. And then I think there's a special private place that my dad and I went camping, the Trinity Alps, where I'm going to go put some of his ashes. But I really am like in no hurry to do it. We did one of them. Next year we'll do another, and I feel like there's no hurry to get his ashes spread. Like, his ashes are in their rightful place right now, right?
There's some of my grandfather right there, just
exactly
on the shelf over there.
Exactly.
On a tiny little ceramic.
Right, and I don't know whether I'll keep them or send them off to where they go, but I feel comfortable. Like, okay, when I'm ready, they'll go to where they're going, and I don't feel like there's a rush. So
yeah,
sort of and then to this day, still I'll have moments where, I'll miss my dad, and I'll call up somebody and be like, hey, you remember how my dad was blah, blah, blah? And they'd be like, yeah, man, that was so crazy,
I think, I suspect that, how much time do we have? I'll just say it out loud. Okay. We're okay. Okay. So, I sensed, well, my brain's doing 10 things at once because I'm trying to like, how can I get these last ideas in before we run out of time? And the fact is we won't, because really this is probably, there's the nature of this conversation leaves a lot of detail out. And so, for example, the types of questions that you asked your family, I think would be very valuable for people to hear, but that in itself is a half hour. 20-minute, half-hour conversation, where we're looking at more like 5 or 10 minutes right now. So I think that might be something that ends up in a blog or in liner notes or something else.
There's
a follow up on.
And I think I didn't mention this. Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters at the End, is a really, really good book to sort of answer the questions about, like, hey, what do you want the end of your life to look like? And it was a really good book, given to me by my mother-in-law, and I read it. She gave it to me a while ago, and it sat there looming and ominously on my bedside for a long time, and then finally I read it, and it was good. I don't know about you, but I got plenty of books that stare at me. Sitting by my bedside.
I have literally a shelf full of them where I bought the book full
They
intention
cast
of
their disparagement and guilt onto me.
Yep. Actually, it's
if I were only a better, like all those horrible
where I want to start a book club to force myself to read some of these books and share those ideas with others. So that may or may not end up on my website at some point, where I actually want it to be like a public book club as I read things. But what I think would be great to kind of end our time is to consider some takeaways for people who might be either in this situation or soon to have this experience.
Right.
Just, 2 or 3 really significant things from your experience. And then to close with being a little more explicit about what a dying ritual would look like as opposed to a death ritual. What it means to be present for this process. So what would you say are some really key takeaways for you from this experience?
Yeah. I think reconciliation doesn't have to be, I think if you are with somebody, whether that is you had a problem with them and you need to reconcile to get to a good place where they're going to pass, it doesn't have to happen before they pass, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a good idea if you do. And that reconciliation with their passing, maybe you weren't around, or maybe the person was taken from you traumatically and quickly. Reconciliation doesn't have to be the same as it was. Meaning, I think we all we strive to let's get it back to the way it was. Like, I have this great memory before whatever happened, whether it was a death or an argument or something. Reconciliation, give yourself the space to know that reconciliation doesn't have to, we have to be before the pre-injury status. We don't have to get you fully back to pre-injury status.
Right.
That things will be different, and that's okay. You just need to get into a space where you're okay, and give yourself space to process and think about it beforehand.
Yeah.
Don't ignore it. And I say don't put it off, but think about it and have conversations about it. And even if they're awkward, be empowered. Be the one to be like, hey, what do we want? Oh, I don't want to talk about it. Okay. But at least you verbalizing it means everybody's aware. And you may not be able to get family to do the small things you can do to armor yourself. That would be the big takeaway, is be gentle with yourself. Fuck anybody who says you're doing it wrong. Right?
Yeah.
And within the resources, prepare as much for the living that are left behind as the dying, which includes, hey, let's maybe not blow all our finances out when my mom's going to have dementia care. And that's not a conversation I had to have with my dad, because they were very smart about how and pragmatic. But I know that it could have been like, hey, how much are we going to spend on this when somebody else might have 15 more years of life, right? Or 10 or whatever it is.
Whatever it happens to be.
And then I think the big ritual would be about putting death in a place where it's not... I mean, our problem with death is fear, right? and
Right.
fear of the unknown, right?
Right.
And even beyond what happens afterwards, it casts a shadow into our expectations. And I would say, I won't say try and normalize death, but don't let it have a stigma. Like, this is a thing that is going to happen, and I can be emotional about it, but I can also be pragmatic and empowered, and turn what is arguably the crux of a person's life, right? Like, this is at the end, into a positive, or not even a positive, but something that you can be at peace with, and whatever that means. And that means deep reflection beforehand, or if you don't get the opportunity beforehand, give yourself space afterwards to really process, and be okay with it. You know, be okay with needing to process. You don't have to be okay with being dead, having somebody dead or dying.
Right.
You just, I mean, I wish I had a summary, and that let's try and find a collective language that will help us communicate better about, like I said, we need a word that says, I am maybe not grieving, but there's a practical sense of stuff that I'm doing right now after this person has passed away, getting ready to prepare the rest of my life, and all those works that I'm doing have profound impact and will change me. And it's like, oh, you're going through this. Oh, there was a really great science fiction movie that just came out, where they meet the aliens, and there's an explosion, one of the aliens dies, and he goes, where's your friend? She goes, where's your friend? And he goes, oh, he is in death process now. And you're like, oh, wow, what a weird collective term for this. And I'm horrible with names, but it was a really great movie.
It's all good. From my perspective, having heard more of the story than you were able to tell in this time, huge takeaways for me were, one, what you just stated, which is really being the fact that you thought to ask the question, how do you want the end of your life to look, to your father? One. And then two, as you mentioned earlier, the fact that you then turned to your mom, not literally in the same moment, but and said, what does his end of life look like to you? So your capacity to be aware of caring for the dying, as well as those who are around, exactly around the dying, yourself included, that you took the time to process that and be with that you have a unique perspective as an anatomist, you have a different relationship with death, and that you were able to translate that into having your father's deathbed, for an intentionally extreme term, your father's deathbed in the middle of your living room while you lived your lives with it present. There's a term in the Toltec practice the idea of making death your friend, or making death your advisor. The idea that death is always with you. Look over your left shoulder and there's death. So when you have a question, ask death. About what's happening with your life, what's happening in the future. Right. This kind of this idea of it of normalizing it. To me, the idea of looking over my left shoulder and doing that terrifies me, and I don't want to know.
But there's wisdom to be gained, right?
But there's wisdom to be gained. But I am a product of both my own innate personality as well as our culture, and so for me, that's terrifying. Yeah, like so you talk about the cadaver lab. It's like, well, that's actually. I wanted to be a doctor when I grew up. When I was 3, someone said, "What do you want to be?" And I said, "I want to be a doctor, a teacher, and a veterinarian." 1 out of 3 is not bad.
Right.
Teacher, of course, I was a massage therapist, etc. But that's what put me off. What put me off was the idea of the body not being integral. The idea of cutting into a body was like, no, I can't do that. I can work on bodies, but that type of was trauma for me. That was my association. The other thing that I take away from this is your idea of acceptance of what is happening, not forcing an expectation of what it should be, but being present with it. Something that we didn't really talk about was the emotional journey from "Dad, you're an asshole" to how you actually reconciled, and the fact that you also had to navigate his dementia. So you reconcile, but then you don't. Because the dementia erases the experience, the one-to-one experience of the reconciliation. Then you have the reconciliation within yourself, but you're dealing with a belligerent person.
Right.
So your ability to be present with that, I also found to be quite profound. And then just lastly, this idea that you brought up that we hadn't talked about before, explicitly common language. Having words like that they have in Denmark and elsewhere, like hyggelik and things like that. We have a word that means sitting vigil with your dying relative. We have a word that means, you know, English is an odd language in that it has so many layers that we don't tend to smash those things together and have something, but it's not something that's present. Just like in our medicine, acute care is primary. In our medicine, chronic care is not primary, and chronic care tends to be how to be slightly less miserable.
Right.
And it's a
geriatric medicine should be keeping you functioning and healthy, and then a quick end, as opposed to let's prolong and protract your suffering.
Exactly.
As though, you know, because I could hold my breath the longest, I won. You know, you're like, wow, okay.
Yeah, exactly. My body's freaking out, but I held my breath the longest, so I win. I think that's great. That's hilarious. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I anticipate that we're going to have some follow-up conversations on or off. You know, I didn't expect us to do a follow-up, but maybe we choose to do a follow-up. But certainly I think... maybe we do it over the phone so you don't have to trek all the way down here. But certainly I think it'll be valuable to some of the details that we weren't able to get to, just like the types of questions that you asked. You gave so many excellent resources. Thank you for that. I'll make sure those all end up in the liner notes and in... and if someone's watching this in video format, it's really going to be a slideshow with audio. They will have seen some of those books. So definitely I want to follow up with you and get all that, capture all those things.
Cool.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. It was like shake your hand even though no one can see it. Thanks. Cool. And here's a little preview of what's coming up next week.
My guest today is the lovely and wonderful Jenny Ward, who is a teacher, a life coach, a parent, a yoga teacher, all-around badass, who I am so happy that I get to hang out with again today for a different topic, being the wrongness of death. So hi, Jenny.
Hi.
So I thought to start, it might be good kind of talk about, I don't know, overview of the loss of your parents. Mm-hmm. Just a couple minutes and let people know kind of what the backstory is on that.
Yeah. It's so funny because when you lose someone, you forget how long ago it was. It's sort of but it seems so recent at the same time.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, like, when did my dad die? And it's like the years, I can't really pinpoint when he died. Probably 5 years ago. But my dad died of cancer first. He was diagnosed and passed away maybe 8 or 9 months later.
Oh, wow. Quick.
It was quick. It felt like eternity in terms of the pain that he went through. And then my mom was diagnosed right after my dad died. And she passed away about a year after that. So they passed away in the time frame of 2 years around this, like, you know, I lost them in 2 years, basically. So I went from burying my dad to going to see my mom, and they lived far away from me, so I had to fly there. And so I feel, in hindsight, it sounds weird, but I was already numb. Like, I lost my dad and I was still on that energy level. So I feel like my mom, I kind of flew right into my mom. It was sort of like, oh, I know how to do this. That sounds crazy, but I think if my mom was 5, 6, 7 years later, I would have been like jolted back into, but it felt like I've already in the pain. I might as well just keep going, sort of.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I already knew the script.
Yeah.
And it sounds like I'm removed from it because I was removed from it.
Yeah.
My goal was to take care of my parents and to basically watch them die. So that was what I was supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Like the show? Consider subscribing through my Patreon at patreon.com/lifecoachingwithryan. You'll get early access to shows and potentially a host of other rewards. Want more? You can also find me streaming on Twitch at twitch.tv/lifecoachingwithryan, where I play some games and I continue the conversation. I'm pretty active on Instagram. You can find me at instagram.com/educate4_life. That's where I do my book club. I record the book club episodes live on Mondays, and then I post them to IGTV. Later, I post them on YouTube. See you next time.